Hello, in this video we will talk about competitive industry in the long run. It builds on the first part of chapter A and B in Prince, so I'm skipping chapters 6 and 7 and feel free to read those if you're interested in learning more about the processes inside the firm and the industry dynamics. But today I will use the building blocks that I talked about in the previous videos, that is the cost curves and the firm's optimal decisions in the short run. I'm going to take those building blocks and I'm going to embed them in a larger model of a competitive industry in the long run. So the model is built on three major assumptions. And the first assumption of the model is that the industry is comprised of a large number of very small firms, small relative to the market size, not necessarily small per se. And these small firms produce identical products so that buyers do not care which particular firm to buy from. And finally, entering and exiting the industry is free. So you don't need a license, you don't need to have specific technology that is hard to obtain. It's really easy to start your own company if you feel like you want to join that industry. So here's how things going to look like. We're going to look at two graphs side by side, and the left graph is going to be devoted to the market in general, the whole market, and it's going to operate according to the demand and supply laws that we've been talking about in the very beginning of the course. And on the right, we're going to look at the demand for the output of an individual firm. And we will say that because that individual firm is small relative to the market, it's going to be a price taker in this market, and its individual demand is going to be perfectly elastic. That means no matter how much or how little the firm is willing to sell, it will be forced to sell it at the current market price. So we'll say that firms are price takers. And so it's interactions in the market in general between the market supply and market demand that will result in the price, but the firm will be looking at that price as given. And before we talk about what happens in this model in the long run, let's look at something that we've already seen before. A firm in the short run in a competitive industry. So suppose that you have a firm that has blue marginal costs, red average variable costs, and yellow average total costs in the short run. And for instance, let's see what happens in this example when price equals to 50. So if the market price is 50, that means that the demand for the firm's output is leveled at 50 no matter how much the firm is willing to produce. So this dashed curve is going to be the individual demand, the demand for the individual firm's output. And given that demand, given the market price, and given the marginal cost, the firm will produce up to the intersection of the marginal cost and the price, which happens at quantity equal to 500. So let's mark that as well. This is the quantity equal to 500, and I think you've seen that derivation before in one of the previous videos. And at that quantity, the average cost is lower than the price, so it costs less than 50, something like 35 to produce a unit of output. So you sell it at 50. That means that you're making about $15 on every unit that you're selling. And that means that your profits will be positive. And let's mark those profits with a green rectangle on the graph. So in this story, in the short run, a price-taking firm is making positive profits because it's producing at the level at which the price is higher than the average cost of production. And so the novelty here, this picture you've seen before, the novelty here is that profits are now a signal for more firms to enter the industry. So because the entry and exit into the industry are free, if there are positive profits for the firms that are currently in the market, that signals for potential firms outside of this industry, outside that market, that they should enter because there is money for them to get. And so if currently firms are making positive profits, we should expect more firms to enter the market. So let's go back to the original picture, the whole market versus the individual firm. And now, if firms currently are making positive profits, more firms enter, and so on the whole market level, more firms means larger supply. So supply increases, but that will affect the price, because with larger supply, price has to go down. But if the price in the market goes down, that means that individual firms will be forced to sell in at a lower price too. So more firms enter the market, price goes down, and let's go back to an individual firm and see how that will affect the firm. So this is where we were. At the price of 50, the firm will be producing 500 and making positive profits. Now, as more firms enter, let's assume that the price drops to 45. So we'll have a new price level of 45. That's bad news because we will have to be forced to produce less. So quantity will drop from 500 to 450. The average costs at 450 are still below the price of 45. So at this level, we still should be expecting to be making positive profit, but presumably with more firms and tighter competition, the amount that we're going to be making is going to reduce. So profit is still positive, but it falls. What does it mean to us? Since the firms are still making positive profits, that means that more firms will still be entering the market. There is still money to be collected for whoever decides to operate in this industry. So more firms will enter, although the profits are falling. As long as the profits are positive, it is an incentive for other firms to enter the market. How long will that last for? More firms enter will bring the price down. Lower price will mean lower profits, but as long as profits are positive, more firms will still enter. So this process will stop at the point where there are no more positive profits. Once firms start getting zero economic profits, there is no more incentive to enter into this market. And getting zero economic profit means that the price level has to fall to the point where price equals minimum average cost. So this gives us the condition for what is going to happen in the long run. Price has to be falling until it reaches the minimum average cost, so that profit reaches zero, so that the incentive for additional firms to enter the industry disappears. And so it just happens to be so conveniently, and I talked about it in one of the previous videos, that the minimum average cost occurs exactly at the intersection with the marginal cost. So the long run equilibrium point is in fact a point where three curves, not just two, intersect. On the one hand, the price level intersects with the marginal cost, so that means that each firm is still trying to maximize its profits. On the other hand, it is tangent to the average cost, so it corresponds to the minimum average cost whatsoever. So each firm is making zero profits. And these two conditions together mean two things. Price equals minimum average cost means each firm is making zero profits. Price equals marginal cost means each firm is maximizing. So that means that each firm is doing its best and still earns zero. So that's not exactly great news for the firms, but if we think about the industry in general, when average costs of production are minimized, that means that the output is produced the most efficient way, the cheapest way possible. You can't imagine producing output in this industry at a lower per unit cost. So this is great that the competition between firms and no barriers to entry into the industry force firms to find the cheapest way to produce output in order to maximize their profits, but the profits ultimately end up being zero. So this competition completely eradicates economic profits from the industry, and brings the price to the smallest cost imaginable. Notice that in this story, we're able to determine the long-run equilibrium price without looking on the demand side at all. We're just saying, well, whatever the minimum of the average cost is, that's going to be the long-run price. The next thing that I'd like to do is look at the adjustments to the equilibrium in the long run. That is, I want to start with the long-run equilibrium and see what happens to it when demand shifts for any reason. So here is the picture from the previous part adjusted for the fact that we know more about what happens in the long-run equilibrium now. So in the long run, we have demand and supply intersect at the price level that corresponds to the minimum average cost, and each firm is maximizing their profits, and their profits are zero in equilibrium in the long run. Let's consider the following question. What happens if the market demand decreases? First of all, let's look at the market in general. Let's draw a smaller demand, so demand shifts to the left. As the demand shifts, the price has to react by falling to the new intersection of demand and supply. And since it falls in the whole market, that means that for each individual firm, the price has to fall as well. What happens when the price falls? The firms are forced to produce even less. In this story, they have to be producing something around 200 units of output, but the price is now below the smallest average cost, so the firms will be making negative economic profits, and if firms are now losing money, some will be forced to shut down. So now in this story, the opposite of what happened in the previous example is going on. So in the previous example, we saw that a positive profit for an individual representative firm in the industry is a signal for other firms to join. In this example, negative profits are incentives to leave the industry. And as firms start to leave the industry, the supply will start to shrink because fewer firms will be willing to offer fewer output at every price. How long is the supply going to fall for? Firms will be exiting for as long as some of them are losing money. So firms will be exiting to the extent that the supply returns back to the level at which the market price is at the minimum average cost. So in this story, whenever anything changes to the demand, the supply automatically adjusts accordingly. Whatever happens to the demand, if demand were to increase, supply is going to increase as well. If demand were to fall, supply is going to fall as well. Because whenever the price is different from the minimum average cost level, there are either positive profits for existing firms and so an incentive for more firms to enter the industry, or if the price is too low, there will be negative profits for existing firms and incentives for some firms to leave the industry. So whenever the price in this market is different from the minimum average cost, it will be forced to actually get to the minimum average cost level. And on the industry level, on the whole market level, this is achieved by the adjustment in the number of firms.